In the name of Allah, the most gracious, ever merciful. Hello there. Hope you are doing well. Please check the quality of sounds. And the picture. And you are free to tell me in the chat if you have any problem. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Jamie. Good evening, everyone in the chat. Okay. Starting our lecture today, we are supposed to discuss how to make a quick revision upon the two different contradictory points of view of both Plato, the teacher, and his student, Aristotle. And of course, this is our medium or our method to understand the literary theory for both of them and their philosophy. So, first of all, we will delve in seeing the perception of poetry to Plato and how Plato attacked poetry and why should he do this. So, of course, if we come to the idea of Plato's attack on poetry, we will discover Plato attacked poetry for many reasons. The most important one is that Plato, of course, against poetry for the reason that poetry is nothing but imitation. Okay? Just to say, according to Plato, poetry is nothing but imitation. Then if you ask me, what's the problem with imitation, doctor? So why should Plato think about imitation as bad thing? Of course, being mimetic or mimesis, which stands for imitation, Plato, considered that all different forms of arts are nothing but imitation. And imitation is something bad, for it takes man 2 steps away from reality. As you know, the philosophy of Plato is based upon the idea of the world is either the perfect form of the world, which is supposed to be utopia, or the world of ideals. And the other side, the world of illusions or the world of copies, which is the world that we live. Just to say, our world for Plato is unreal world. Why? Because it is imperfect. The perfect world is the world of ideals, the world of perfect things. And that's why he considers all different shapes of arts as mimesis or do mimetic things. As you say, if we consider the world of reality to Plato, we shouldn't consider it unless we have the power that enable us to do it, which is the power of reason, the power of rationality. It's not the power of the five senses by means of which we could achieve the realization of the world. That is to say, Plato put reason as the method of our realization of the world around us. Not the senses, not the five senses. We could not achieve the realization of the surrounding world, the environment around us by means of sight, by means of touch, by means of feeling, by means of smelling. No, not at all. We couldn't, according to Plato, realize the world unless we have the power of reason. Then, what does a poet as an artist do for Plato? A poet actually, when he comes to write a poem or utter a poem, he does nothing but describing the copy, the world of copies. And that's to say, he took me as a man, as a person, 2 steps away from the world of ideas. That's to say, he make a copy of a copy. That's to say, if he, for example, writing a poem about his beloved woman, so you say, he made a copy of that beloved woman described in words, that's to say, me as audience, supposed to be taken 2 steps far away from the world of reality, of the world of ideals. By the same token, we have the other forms of art. For example, musicians, for example, sculptures, or other forms of arts. This pushed Plato towards banishing poets out of his republic. The most important book for Plato was the Republic. And to understand the Republic, he made analogy between the structure of the police, or what's meant by the Republic, and the structure of the human being himself. How? Plato makes such analogy by dividing the human psyche into 3 parts: the head, the chest, and the belly. And he assumed that these 3 parts are overwhelmed by different types of powers. So the head is overwhelmed by the power of reason, power of rationale, and the chest is supposed to be overwhelmed by the power of zeal or courage, and the belly, which is overwhelmed by the power of desire. As the same categorization of the human body, he made such category or categorization for the police. The police, which is P-O-L-I-S-E, supposed to be the symbol of the Republic. By the same token, it is composed of 3 classes. And these three classes are classified according to the power that is dominant in each class. So the class of guardians, the class of the common people, and the class of the commanders or rulers. So the common people of the Republic are supposed to be overwhelmed by the power of desire. And they are supposed to do the function of serving the society. What does it mean to serve the society? That's to say, to do the works for the service of society, like farming, like trade, like industry, and of course, that common class are controlled by the upper one, which is supposed to be the commanders, the soldiers, and the warriors. Why? Because those people are overwhelmed by the power of zeal, courage, enthusiasm, and so on. And of course, such people are typically those who defend the borders of the Republic. And as a result of that, they are supposed to be a step forward and having the power to control the lower class, which is supposed to be the common class. The top class, which is the guardian, and these are overwhelmed by the power of reason, the power of rationality. And those are the commanders, the rulers, and the presidents of a state or a republic, the monarchy, and so on. Those people are supposed to be overwhelmed by the mental power, by the reason power. And that's why it comes on the top of the social scale and have the power over the other two categories or two classes within the society. So, by the same token, we have the categorization of Plato for the human psyche as well as for the polis or for the Republic. So, in this way, we could understand why Plato banished poets out of the Republic, because he considered their role as useless, because they are not to be classified, or they are not to be categorized according to one of these classes. They do nothing but uttering words. And of course, that attitude could be classified according to the following grounds. Number one, poetic inspiration. According to Plato, poets are divinely inspired. What does it mean? That means they have nothing original. How? According to Plato, it's the revelation of divine power. So you say poetry is not an original quality or capacity inculcated within the personality of the poet, However, he uttered something in a very frenzied state, and he is even unable to interpret it or to explain it. When you ask a poet, what does this line mean? Or what do you mean by that part of the poem? He would answer, I don't know. It comes in this way. And of course, that's what makes them irrational. They are producing poetry in a frenzied state. They say they are even unable to explain it or interpret it. Fantastic. That's it. What else? Number 2, the emotional appeal of poetry. At the era of Plato, poetry are well known to be either epic or dramatic or lyric. And of course, either comedy or tragedy or epic pieces of literature, according to Plato, appealing to nothing but the base instinct of a human being. So to say, they are appealing to the feeling of anger, the feeling of incest, the feeling of sexual desire, the feeling of a vengeance. And of course, all of these are socially destructive for society. Also, via tragedy, that literary work produces nothing but the feeling of pity and fear. And of course, the pity and fear is appropriate for women, not for men. And it is a sort of destroying the nature of man within a society. The third ground upon which Plato attacked poetry, its non-moral character. So to say, poets are immoral people. Why? Because Plato thinks that telling lies about gods are immoral action. If we considered tragedies of great authors like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, we would discover that they are telling stories about gods who committed adultery, who telling lies, and of course, all of these things are supposed to destroy the morality among the young generations. So, if we admit that thing that would have its bad effect upon our new generation, and it should be banished away from our educational system. Some writers considered a fourth ground for Plato's attack on poetry by putting the idea of utilitarian ground or background. Let us say why Plato considered poets as useless members of society, and they are not supposed to be members of society because they actually do nothing for society. They just only uttering words, and these words do nothing for society. And it's a matter of work, it's a matter of achievements, it's a matter of actions, not a matter of words. And that's why Plato considered them in a utilitarian attitude. Okay? That's right. So that's why Plato attacked poetry and how he saw both the human psyche and the society or the republic. Okay, that's the major idea of mimesis or attack, Plato's attack on poetry. Now it's the time to look on the other side how Aristotle perceived poetry and how he considered imitation or mimesis. Of course, according to Aristotle, imitation is not a bad thing. They say imitation actually is a very useful thing. It is an essential thing. It's a creative thing. How? Because according to Aristotle, mimesis or imitation is the process by means of which we acquire our own native language. Let us say, by means of which we acquire our own language. We couldn't acquire our language unless we have imitation. The young baby stayed for about 2.5 years, do nothing but listening to the people around him. And he is trying to grasp the meaning out of the context. And that's the same way of acquiring our elements of culture, our lifestyle. So, imitation or mimesis for Aristotle is not a bad thing, but on the contrary, it is a creative thing. Fantastic, very good. Another way, Aristotle considers that even though imitation is included within the different types of arts, however, it is different in the medium of imitation. How? According to Aristotle, if we have the imitation as a medium in poetry, it's completely different from imitation as a medium in music. By the same token, it is completely different from the imitation in sculpture. So, having imitation in painting, imitation in poetry, imitation in sculpture, imitation in music, all of these are forms of imitation. Yet, Even though the same method is imitation, yet we have different manners of imitation. So, for music, the manner of imitation is melody. For sculpture, the medium of imitation is stone. For poetry, the medium of imitation is words. So, just to say, even though we have mimesis or imitation as a technique for different types of arts, yet we have different manners of imitation. Okay, that's it. Even we have the same manners of imitation, we could have different manners. So you say, if we could have the same medium of imitation, we could have different manners. So if we go deeper in poetry, and we discovered that there were 3 types of poetry at that time of Plato and Aristotle. The first one is epic poetry. The second is dramatic poetry. The third is lyric poetry. So if we have all these 3 shapes of poetry having the same medium of words, yet we have different manners. So the manner for epic poetry is narration. The manner of dramatic poetry is action or performance. So, although we have the same medium of words, we have different manners. That's it. If we go deeper on the level of the same manner, we could have difference in the idea of the topic or the object. So if we go deeper in the dramatic poetry, we could have whether this performance or action dealing with a serious action, which is supposed to be tragedy, or with a trivial subject, which is supposed to be the comedy. And according to Aristotle, tragedy is supposed to represent man better than what he really is. Unlike it, comedy represents man worse than he really is. So, according to Aristotle, on the other side of Plato, we have him considering the poetry according to the different mediums of imitation, as well as the different manners of imitation and the different subjects of imitation. So, if we considered imitation as one medium for different types of arts, we would discover that one medium of imitation differs in the idea of manners and differs in the idea of topic. That's it. Okay. So, by this we recognize that, unlike Plato, Aristotle considered imitation not as a bad thing, but on the contrary, it is a good creative thing. And it is not all the shapes of imitation are the same. So if you have imitation for music, for poetry, for sculpture, for painting, yet we have different mediums for each one. We have colors for painting, we have stone for sculpture, we have words for poetry, and we have melody for music. If we go deeper in poetry medium, which is supposed to be the words, we could go deeper to see if we have the same medium of words in poetry. According to the classification of poetry into epic poetry or dramatic poetry, we have different manners. For the epic poetry, we have narration. For the dramatic poetry, we have performance. Also, on the other, or on the deeper level, if we go in the action or the performance of dramatic poetry, we could have different topic or object for each. So as you say, we have the same medium, words, and we have the same manners, actions or performance. We could have also different object or different topics or subject, which is supposed to be either tragedy, a serious topic, or comedy as a trivial topic. Very good, fantastic. So, realizing that, Aristotle considered imitation and poetry, of course, particularly tragedy, as very important for a human being. Then we come to the idea, what is tragedy for Aristotle? Actually, tragedy for Aristotle is an imitation of action that is serious, complete, and of certain magnitude, beautified in different kinds of language of embellishment. Through action and careful phase, removing the bad feelings of audience. So as you say, this definition, through which we could guess what are the elements of tragedy according to Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle, during his work as a teacher of tragedy, he started to make his own analysis of tragedy on that way. So the style of Aristotle, unlike that of Plato, which is written in oracular method, in a didactic method, and by the way, Plato wrote his books in a poetic form, which means that Plato is not all the way against poetry. So if poetry for Plato has the didactic function, teaching morality, he would accept it in his Republic. So, unlike the way he attacked poets, he made or wrote his books in a poetic form, which means that he, with the didactic form of literature. And one piece of evidence is that he himself wrote his books in a poetic oracular form. Very good. So, tragedy, according to Aristotle, once again, is an imitation of action that is serious, complete, of certain magnitude, beautified in different kinds of language of embellishment, via action, not narration, and catharsis. doing away with the bad feeling of the audience. What does it mean? This means that the tragedy is not a bad thing for society. It is for the God of society. So, according to Aristotle, tragedy is a very important thing. How? Because tragedy for him is for the God of society via the feeling of Betty and Thur, which is catharsis or cathartic effect. How? Because according to Aristotle, the cathartic effect is the process through which the purification, the salvation of bad emotion, bad feelings would enable the audience to get rid of all negative, bad feelings. So, through betting others, we stop betting ourselves. Through feeling the fear of others, we would appreciate fear in ourselves, and we would appreciate the condition of peace that we are experiencing. So, when I, as audience, stand and imagine myself in the position of the tragic hero, I'd betty him. And on the other side, I would think that what would happen if I were in his shoes. And that, of course, would help me release and relieve myself. So if you remember, Christopher Marlowe, Dr. Faustus, when Mephistopheles asked, Dr. Faustus asked Mephistopheles, "What good does my soul do for you?" Mephistopheles said, "To enlarge my kingdom." And he started to utter the Latin expression, "Solamen miseris habuis sacios doloris," which means that an individual might be relieved if he find himself among other inflicted by an ordeal. So instead of being alone in such ordeal, in such predicament, or in such a problem, finding yourself among the other people in such a problem, that of course would let you feel relieved, and at the same time feel that you having a sort of comfortable feeling. So say, tragedy, on this definition, is supposed to be based on the idea of the plot or the dramatic structure. And that's a question that we must ask ourselves. If that is the meaning of tragedy for Aristotle, so what are the components of tragedy? What are the elements of tragedy? Really, we have 6 elements of tragedy, and going through them, we would discuss each element separately. Of course, why is tragedy? I said Aristotle considered tragedy is better than epic, which is supposed to be a long story a long narrative story about heroic action, this often ends with a catastrophic end for the tragic hero. Yet, this manner of epic is narrative, and that of tragedy is performance or action. And of course, when we come to the idea of what's the difference between narration, reciting the stories, and performing action in front of audience, of course, we would consider performance or action as more convincing for audience rather than listening to the parts or elements of a story. And why is tragedy rather than comedy? Because according to Aristotle, he considers tragedy as the best literary genre ever known, even though it is next in the matter of time to epic. Yet tragedy has such cathartic effect of purification for audience rather than that of epic narration. And of course, as I told you, Aristotle sees tragedy representing man better than he really is, not worse than he really is as comedy. That's it. So, what are the tragic hero? Of course, the tragic hero from the word tragedy, this represents the first element of tragedy, which is supposed to be characters. So, characters are the personae in a tragedy. And the most important one is the tragic hero, who is supposed to be a human being. And that human being must be of certain characteristics to do the function he is supposed to do it. Because he has a great function to represent for audience. So, the first one is goodness. Let's say a tragic hero must be good, but by the same token, he must not be too good. You say he mustn't be perfect. He must be a man like every one of us. He must be all in all a good man, but not too good. Why? Because being perfect is unreal. It is unreal to think about man as a perfect model. And at the same time, it would hurt the feeling of audience if we considered him as perfect, and it is unfair for him to face the catastrophic end if he is a perfect or too perfect man. So he must be a good man, and that good man at a certain moment make an error of judgment or a miscalculation, and as a result of that, he made a mistake. That mistake would be the cause for his lamentable catastrophic end. Whether this mistake attributed to the miscalculation or the error of judgment, or even to a disorder within his psychological structure. For example, we have tragic heroes who are suffered from the idea of procrastination, like Hamlet, or the problem of overambition, like Macbeth, or the problem of bride, like that of King Lear, and on the other side, we have the problem of absurdity for Oedipus Rex or King Oedipus. And if we notice the difference between the Shakespearean tragic hero on one hand and that ancient Greek tragic hero, we would discover why Plato attacked poets and the writer of tragedies. Because King Oedipus, the absurdity of his destiny made him kill his father and get married to his mother, unaware of doing mistakes. So he himself was innocent. He did nothing to be blamed for in reality, because when he killed his father, he was not aware that that man was his father. And when he got married to that woman, he was not aware that that woman was his real mother. Of course. And that's why on the Greek tragedies, we have the idea of goodness is a semi-perfect model for a tragic hero. And that miscalculation or that error of judgment is actually put on the side of gods rather than the tragic hero. Okay, that's it. Of course, the other characteristic of the tragic hero, appropriateness. What's the meaning of appropriateness? So you say, according to tragedy for the Greeks, each character within the tragedy must behave on the appropriate way. So a boy or a king or a queen, a prince must behave in an appropriate way, suitable for his position, for his age, and for his degree. So it is unacceptable for a character to behave in inappropriate way. And that's, of course, what make the character match the language or the diction. Number 3, a tragic hero must have likeness. What's the meaning of likeness? Likeness actually is that tragic hero must not be a sober man, must not be an idealistic form of humanity. He must be a man like every one of us. Why? Because that's what helps us to feel sympathy with them, to feel the fear he suffered. That's what helps us to experience catharsis or experience cathartic affect. So if that man is abnormal, is ideal, is a Superman, this effect would not achieve its function. So that tragic hero must be a man of every one of us. He must be a man like every one of us. He must be a man of good nature, yet he is not a Superman. And that's, of course, what helps us to feel sympathy with them. the last thing is hamartia. What's the meaning of hamartia? Hamartia, as I told you, is the tragic flow. So that man or that character must have hamartia. The hamartia is the tragic flow, and tragic flow, as I told you, could be attributed to either miscalculation or an error of judgment in a certain situation, or on the other hand, it could be an outcome of a psychological disorder like procrastination, overambition, pride, and so on. That's it. Okay, very good. So that's what's meant by characters and what's the meaning of tragic hero. The next element of tragedy is plot or dramatic action. Of course, the word plot is often used with narrative, with a novel, short story, and of course it could be used with dramatic form of literature, yet when we come to drama, it's better to say it dramatic action. So, dramatic action actually is what's meant by an imitation of action. So tragedy is an imitation of action that is serious. So the idea of serious is referring to the topic. So if we said that topic is trivial, then we say we are meaning the tragedy, the comedy, unlike the tragedy, which is supposed to be serious topic or serious subject. And when we come to the idea of complete, so serious, complete, and of certain magnitude. That's it. So complete, this refers to the forms or the different forms of dramatic action or the plot. So how many forms of dramatic action or how many forms of plot within the tragedy? Actually, we have 3 different forms of plot for tragedy. We have the first one, complex form of tragedy. And the complex form of tragedy, which is supposed to be following the triadic structure of tragedy. What is the triadic structure of tragedy? The triadic structure of tragedy is to have the exposition, the first part of the tragedy. Then we have the raising action. Then we have the climax, then the falling action, then the dynamo or the resolution. So, in the exposition, we are supposed to be introduced to different types of characters. Also, we are supposed to be introduced to the setting, whether it is temporal or spatial setting. In the exposition, we are supposed to be introduced to the elements, so the basic elements of conflict. What are the basic powers of conflict within the tragedy? That's fantastic. So then by the rising action, we come to the idea of the escalation in the problem or in the major problem, either by the development of that problem or either by having an extra relevant problems or crisis. So by this, I have the rhythm of the actions rising till it achieved the climax. Then we have it down again in its way to be solved, or in its way to have all the major problem and its relevant ones are coming to an end in the form of resolution or the denouement. So that is the idealistic form of the complex structure of dramatic action or dramatic plot. Then, that's to say, I have another form of plot for tragedy. Yes, of course, I have the simple form of plot for tragedy. Then what is the simple form of tragedy? Actually, the simple form of tragedy represents having the tragedy with an exposition and a denouement without having complication. So I have a starting, an introduction, and a conclusion. I having exposition, and I have a conclusion, or I have a denouement without having a complication of the action. So as to say, all of these complications are simply hidden or simply without a complication. And this is not favorable for Aristotle. By the way, why? Because according to Aristotle, the complication is very important for achieving catharsis. Why? Because imagine that you have a story of a good man who is supposed to be run over by a lorry or articulated lorry getting out of his house without any complication of his idea. This would help to feel that it's unfair for that good man without making any mistakes, without making any miscalculation, without making any error of judgment, and having himself run over by that articulated lorry. Of course, this would make you feel so sad. And of course, it's not the same feeling of pity and fear if we have the complete complication of that triadic structure of drama, or triadic structure of this tragedy. Okay, so that's why this type of tragedy for Aristotle is not favorable. The third type of plot or dramatic action is the episodic one. Episodic plot or episodic dramatic action. What does it mean by episodic plot? Actually, I mean by episodic plot when I have exposition, complication, yet no catastrophe or no denouement or no resolution. It's something like the theories. So, for example, if we have a series of action, and when I come to the end, he said, if you would like to know the end of this, wait for the next series. Of course, this would cause a sort of frustration for audience. And at the same time, it doesn't achieve the effect of the idea of catharsis. Because the function of tragedy for Aristotle is to achieve the idea of catharsis and to achieve the effect of catharsis upon audience. So to have the purification of negative feeling and emotion within audience by that pity and fear caused by the catastrophic end and the lamentable catastrophic lot of the tragic hero. So if we haven't such end or such catastrophe by the end of that tragedy, we won't have such catharsis effect on audience. And of course, this too was not favorable for Aristotle. Okay, then what about the other elements of tragedy? Of course, as we said, characters, and speaking about the most important representative of characters within that element, which is supposed to be the tragic character. Next element is thought. And in that idea, we are supposed to differentiate between three types of thought. Number one, theme. Number two, vision. And number three is a motive. Then what are the difference between all these? Of course, all of them are moral lessons taught via such a tragedy. So, what are these moral lessons taught by that literary work, and what is the difference between the idea of theme and the idea of vision and the idea of motive? If such moral lesson related to the present, so if that work is teaching me about a lesson concerning that present time in which I live, that's what's meant by a theme. And of course, there are different types of themes. There are major themes and there are minor themes. Yet, we must be concerned with recognizing the idea of the unity of action, the unity of time, and the unity of place for tragedy. So, theme here is the moral lesson concerning with the present time. So that moral lesson is taught to the future. That is, say, the tragedy is teaching me something for the future. It's teaching me a sort of prophecy about the future. So that would teach me what is known as vision. Okay, then what is motive? Although motive is a moral lesson taught by literary work, yet it is different from the idea of theme and vision in the idea of recurrence or recurrence. That is, say, this is a recurrent lesson in the writings of the one writer or the different writers in different ages. Okay? Of course, this is the message that a writer would like to deliver to us via his own literary work. So the message, of course, might be, for example, pride or overambition is a fatal thing. So whenever you read some tragedy, like, for example, that of Macbeth, you'll discover that overambition for power is a fatal thing. So that's a message delivered us via Macbeth tragedy. The other element of tragedy is diction. And of course, I mean by diction language. And the language, as we taken from the definition of tragedy is that beautified in different kinds of language. Beautified in different kinds of language of embellishment. What does it mean? That the language of tragedy must be beautified. Beautified in what? In the idea of figures of speech. In the idea of being written in the form of poetic language. So these works are these tragedies written in the poetic form. They say it has figures of speech, and at the same time it has the music, the musical language. And of course, it wouldn't be in the language of everyday life or the common language or colloquialism. And in this way, I would achieve that sort of elevated or highly elevated language appropriate to each character within that tragedy. Okay? So diction here means language, which is supposed to be beautified in the idea of the decorum or the appropriateness of each language for each character, or via figure of speech, or via the musical language or the poetic form of language. Then what else? What is the next element of tragedy? It is song. So what is meant by song? Song, of course, here means the chorale, or means a group of children who performing the song in the intervals and at the beginning and by the end of the tragedy. Of course, such chorus or such chorale of children playing a very important role. That role is supposed initially to entertain audience in the intervals and among the scenes and the acts of the tragedy. Yet they have a very serious, crucial role in tragedy. Number one, by means of the chorus, we are introduced to the major characters. By means of chorus, we are introduced to the history, to the pastness of the tragedy, to the previous escalation and problems that we are not allowed to achieve it within the unity of time. So the chorus performing such function for us. So it's a method of exposition for us, and at the same time it exposing the character on its real form for us, to help us to feel such pity and fear for him. So that is what makes song as a very important element within the elements of tragedy. The last one is a spectacle. And of course, a spectacle means whatever seen on the stage rather than the characters. That's to say, it is like the setting, whether it is spatial or temporal. So the decor, the decoration, the costumes, the lighting, and everything surrounding the characters is a spectacle. So, of course, that would help us to lay down the setting. And the spectacle has to be categorized into two different ways. The first one is literal spectacle, that everything that we could conceive via the five senses, we could see, we could smell, and we could touch or feel. However, there is a metaphorical spectacle, and that's what I could understand out of the visual seeing. That's to say, if I have, for example, a desert or barren land as a background for the audience, for the characters, or for example, dark clouds, or for example, a storm, all of these would make me predict that the future of that characters are very dark, and there is a melancholy atmosphere for these actions. Okay, so that is spectacle, and that's the last element of the 6 elements of a tragedy. Of course, that's the last element of a tragedy, and inshallah, in the next time we will go on identifying the different movements of literary criticism and certain terms or critical terms concerning poetry and literary theory. That's enough for today. Thanks for watching. Hopefully see you soon again in another academic lecture. Have a nice day and goodbye. Before finishing, do you have any question? Sorry. Before finishing, do you have any question? If anyone have any question, yeah, concerning what I have already discussed. Do you have any questions? Hi. Yeah, thank you very much for all of you. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Does anyone have any questions? If any one of you have any question, it could write it in the chat room. Okay, do you have any questions? Thank you very much. That's all for today. And that's are the major elements that you should be concerned with studying the theory of literature for Plato and Aristotle. Thank you very much. Hopefully see you soon again.